shocking announcement. UK Prime Minister Liz Truss resigns after just a few weeks in office. We examine what happened and what comes next. Headed to court. New developments in the case of the man in Michigan accused of shooting an 84-year-old pro-lifer. And Lily of the Mohawks. A closer look at the Mass tomorrow in Washington, D.C., honoring St. Kateri. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, October 20th, 2022. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. British Prime Minister Liz Truss has resigned. The move comes after her policies triggered turmoil in the financial markets, and she lost 2 cabinet members in just the past week. She says she spoke this morning with a Conservative Party leader.
We've agreed that there will be a leadership election to be completed within the next week. This will ensure that we remain on a path to deliver our fiscal plans and maintain our country's economic stability and national security. I will remain as Prime Minister.
Prime Minister Truss served in office for just 6 weeks. She says she will remain until the process to find a successor has begun. However, Britain's main opposition leader is calling for an immediate general election. Also tonight, new developments in the case of an 84-year-old pro-lifer in Michigan who was shot while canvassing against a pro-abortion measure. Richard Harvey has now been ordered to stand trial. He faces charges of assault and careless discharge of a weapon. He is alleged to have shot Joanne Jacobson, who was treated for her wound and released. Well, it is not every day that we get the chance to ask President Joe Biden directly about abortion, but today we got that opportunity, albeit in a hurried, noisy environment. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen.
Hi, Tracy. That's right. Good evening to you. Before President Biden took off for Pennsylvania today, I was able to ask him some questions just for a few moments before he boarded Marine One. Take a listen.
Mr. President, should there be any restrictions on abortion at all? Any restrictions on abortion at all?
Yes, there should be.
What should they be?
And Roe v. Wade. Read it, man. You'll get educated.
No, I'm going to ask you.
Later, President Joe Biden visited a bridge in Pittsburgh that collapsed earlier this year.
With the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're doing something about it. This is just one of 2,400 bridges across the country that are being repaired just this year because of this law.
A new span, soon to be finished, is now being built. The White House crediting the bipartisan infrastructure law with speeding things up. $40 billion of the roughly $1 trillion law is going to bridges.
But, you know, this is one bridge also tells a broader story. There are nearly 45,000, say it again, 45,000 bridges across this country in poor condition.
But with the midterms moving in fast, voters in Pennsylvania and elsewhere are finding out heating bills will put a chill in their finances this winter. According to Energy Department projections, heating bills for those who use natural gas will jump 28% this winter, heating oil 27%, and electricity 10%. Earlier, the president released a one-paragraph statement on the resignation of British Prime Minister Liz Truss, writing in part, "The United States and the United Kingdom are strong allies and enduring friends. I thank Prime Minister Liz Truss for her partnership on a range of issues, including holding Russia accountable for its war against Ukraine."
And later tonight, with control of the U.S. Senate at stake, President Biden is stopping in Philadelphia at a fundraiser for Democratic Senate candidate John Fetterman. It's between Fetterman and Republican Senate candidate Dr. Mehmet Oz for the open seat in Pennsylvania, a very closely watched race indeed. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
While President Biden calls recent inflation reports political spin, small business owners are gearing up for what could be a very lean holiday shopping season. All of this as the IRS announces some big changes to the tax bracket and a plan to up the standard deduction for 2023. We go now to Joel Griffith, Research Fellow for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, good to see you as always. I want to get right to that big announcement from the IRS. Can you tell us what's in it, and also what will it mean for Americans?
Well, over the past year, families have seen a pay cut of around $6,000 a year due to inflation. All this IRS announcement does is say, look, because of the cost of living increases and because of inflation, the tax brackets are going to increase by 7%, meaning if you were earning $100,000, well, you might pay a little less on that $100,000. But here's what it means to the typical middle-class family. If you're a middle-class couple earning $60,000 each per year, you have seen your expenses go up by around $10,000 annually. You've seen a wage hike of only about $5,000. That's a $5,000 reduction in your take-home pay. And guess what? Your taxes are still going to go up in the coming year to the tune of around $700, even with the bracket adjustment.
Yeah, another thing I want to talk about. Yesterday, President Biden announced plans to dip into that strategic petroleum reserve, about 15 million barrels of it. Of course, this is not the first time that the Biden administration has done this, Joel. So that said, what do you think about this move?
Well, the Biden administration is draining our strategic petroleum reserves in order to score some cheap political points in the hopes of reducing gas prices. Let's remember what those reserves are there for. Those reserves are to ensure that if we come under attack or if we have a natural disaster, that we will have oil on hand to ensure that we can ship things like food across the country and to ensure that we can heat our homes during the wintertime and to provide fuel for our vehicles in the event of a natural disaster or an enemy attack. Those reserves were not in place to try to impact prices or to score political points. The bottom line is, even with the reserves being released, we are still seeing gas prices increasing. And that's because we have put a limit on the supply of gas in this company. We have seen this administration declare war on the fossil fuel industry, and we continue to see refineries shut down, and we continue to see this administration try to block pipelines from being constructed. That is why we are seeing the costs of oil and gas go up.
Yeah, and we are certainly all feeling the pain, at the pump, and not just there, also at the grocery store. It seems everything is going up these days, but it also seems that President Biden continues to dig his heels in, essentially saying that Americans have been squeezed by the cost of living for years now. Joel, what's your reaction to that statement?
Well, that statement is factually untrue. In fact, just prior to President Biden taking office, we saw median household income in real terms, inflation adjustment terms, we saw real household income at all-time highs. It's only since President Biden came into office that we've seen these families fall behind. Since the beginning of 2021, when President Biden took office, the typical middle-class family has seen their real income decline by over $6,000 per year. And we're all feeling it. If you go to the grocery store, you're buying some eggs, you know those eggs are 30 or 40% more than they were a year ago. Costs more to buy a home, to rent a home, to fill up your car, to buy a car. Middle-class families are suffering right now because of the policies put in place by this administration.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, Joel, it seems it's so bad in New England. I read today that some lending institutions in Maine are actually offering people loans just to pay their heating fuel costs. So it is that bad. I want to quickly, we're almost running out of time, but I quickly want to talk about this. We're going to jump across the pond now to the news of departing British Prime Minister Liz Truss. Many say that her economic policies were disastrous. I want to get your thoughts on that. What do you think?
The crisis in the United Kingdom has been building for years, and that's because we have seen their government, like ours, spending far beyond their means. We saw the central bank in the United Kingdom printing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of pounds. And then on top of that, we have seen the United Kingdom political parties pushing forward their version of a Green New Deal, trying to force consumers and businesses to use renewable energy. And with the war between Russia and Ukraine, that has really highlighted just how dangerous it has been to force businesses and families away from using the abundant natural gas supplies that were available. And we've seen that come to a crescendo. It wasn't her fault that England ran into these problems, but she is now bearing the consequences of that.
Well, Joel, so much more we could talk about, but we have to leave it right there. Thank you so much, as always. We appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me, Tracy.
Well, the Vatican is defending its decision to have a pro-abortion member on the Pontifical Academy For Life. The organization says that it welcomes interreligious and intercultural dialogue. The pro-abortion professor in London was recently appointed to a 5-year term. Well, several dozen EWTN employees from around the world are gathered in Rome this week. Yesterday, they met with the Vatican's Secretary of State. Cardinal Pietro Parolin spoke of the value of accurate information. He also recalled EWTN foundress Mother Angelica, citing her as an example of someone who broke down walls and built bridges. We go now to Matthew Bunson, EWTN News Executive Editor and D.C. Bureau Chief, who is in Rome for the meetings. Dr. Bunson, great to be with you. Can you tell us more about the remarks from Cardinal Parolin and what stood out the most to you?
Well, I think one of the most immediately striking things is the fact that he was so generous with his time in coming to meet with all of the participants here at this affiliates meeting that is bringing members of the EWTN family from all over the world here to Rome to meet really in the first time in several years in person. So that itself was a significant event. One of the things that jumps out at me in particular about the Cardinal's comments to all of us last night was his stress on the importance of truth as a function of communications. He mentioned Mother Angelica and her courage and her pursuit of truth. But then he also framed it within sort of the context of something that we've not heard a little bit about for a while, and that's the new evangelization, which is one of the pillars in many ways of the pontificate of Pope Benedict XVI, which is finding new ways to communicate the unchanging truths of the Church in a way that the modern world can understand, which of course is one of the great tasks given to us by the Second Vatican Council. So the fact that the Cardinal stressed this new evangelization, but then tied that closely to the important idea of communion, of allowing communications, of news, of media to be bridges, to build a communion of people, and at the same time as Catholic media to be in communion with the Holy Father. So it was a beautifully put together speech by the Secretary of State, and I think it was a message that we all can take to heart.
Yeah, and I know also today you were inside the Vatican and you also met with the head of the Holy See Communications Office. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, that was Dr. Paolo Ruffini, who runs the Dicastery of Social Communications, the Dicastery of Communications, which has been subject to some reform over the last few years, subject, of course, to the changes that Pope Francis introduced, in particular with the reform of the Roman Curia, Predicate Evangelium. So he oversees now a multimedia dicastery, which I think is important to note. He picked up on some of the themes, actually, of Cardinal Parolin and the idea of communion, the idea as well of evangelization. He talked about the digital world as being so important now to evangelization. It's always a good thing to have an opportunity to encounter the officials of the Vatican, of the Roman Curia, in particular, the Office of Social Communications, given the central role that now must play in disseminating the truths of the faith, but also to really help professionalize global social communications for the whole of the Church.
Yeah, so important. Before I let you go, unfortunately, I understand there's a little bit of sad news today. A longtime friend of the network and of Mother Angelica passed away. Can you talk to us more about Father John Horgan?
Yes, it's a name perhaps that many of our viewers recognize, but many of our viewers and listeners will also recognize his voice. Father Horgan died after a struggle with cancer. He was something of a fixture in the Archdiocese, I believe, of Vancouver. So he was a member of the Board of Governors of EWTN. I'll come back to that in a second. In his own right, though, separate from just as his service to the Church, he was a brilliant moral theologian. He was an expert in the saints. He was a much sought-after speaker. But for EWTN as well, as I said, he was a very familiar face and voice. He did a number of series for EWTN. He was down in Irondale in our headquarters in Alabama. Again, one of those great figures that sometimes we can overlook. His passing, however, is a great loss to all of us, especially those of us in the EWTN family.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Bunson, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it. Dr. Matthew Bunson, EWTN News Executive Editor and DC Bureau Chief. Thank you again. Coming up, Rabbi Yaakov Menken examines the rising trend of anti-Semitism on U.S. college campuses. anti-hate group gives several prominent U.S. colleges a failing grade for anti-Semitic or anti-Israel activity on campus. The Anti-Defamation League reports more than 300 incidents on U.S. college campuses during the 2021 to 2022 school year. Joining us now to discuss is Rabbi Yaakov Menken, Managing Director of the Coalition for Jewish Values. Rabbi, welcome back. Always good to be with you. The ADL report also includes incidents of vandalism, physical assault, and exclusion of Jewish students from certain campus organizations. I want to get your thoughts on all this, and what do you think is behind this uptick?
Well, glad to be with you. Wish it was under for a better topic, as it were. But obviously, religious liberty is under attack on a lot of fronts, and anti-Semitism, it's the Jews being the canary in the coal mine once again. What we're watching is a new facade of being used of quote unquote Palestinian liberation, as if the Jews, the promised land, everybody knows what the promised land is. Everybody knows who was promised to. But on college campuses today, as part of an attack on the Bible overall, they want you to pretend that those lines don't exist. And in fact, the traditional Judaism doesn't exist, because in our liturgy on a daily basis, we are praying for return to Jerusalem, rebuilding of Jerusalem, ingathering the exiles, and restoration of the divine presence in the Holy Temple. So, we've never given up on the Holy Land, and they want to tell you that it actually belongs to somebody else.
Yeah, meantime, at Amherst University in Massachusetts, apparently the student newspaper there published a piece entitled "In Defense of Hamas," saying in part, quote, "While Hamas may aptly be called a terrorist organization, if they are one, Israel and the U.S. government are equally as violent and less justified." I'd like to get your reaction to that.
Well, to be honest, the paper in question is not the student newspaper. It's one that likes to publish so-called contrarian ideas, like, is democracy really a bad thing, for example. But this was obviously an atrocious thing that any student would imagine, much less publish, trying to defend a terror organization that intentionally targets civilians for murder and uses the quote-unquote building of settlements, otherwise known as allowing Jews to have a home, as a violent act. There's something really interesting about this which people need to think about, which is that if you go back to 1979, when the Provisional Irish Republican Army blew up Lord Mountbatten's boat and killed him as a civilian, killed his wife, killed his deckhand, that almost destroyed the IRA. The Chechen rebellion, essentially everybody around the world lost interest in the Chechen rebellion when they took a page out of the Palestinian playbook, took over a school, and children were killed. Nobody has sympathy for organizations that deliberately target children unless those children are Jews in Israel.
Rabbi Menken, we're almost out of time, but I also want to get your reaction to what's happening in Australia, where government leaders have just announced that they will no longer recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This comes as quite a departure from their previous stance. What's your take on all this?
Jerusalem has only been one nation's capital ever in history. It has always been somebody else's far-flung province, and there's only one government that has ever provided religious liberty for Jews, Christians, and Muslims who want to worship there. It is the eternal capital of the Jewish nation, of the nation of Israel. And as far as the modern country of Israel, it's not dependent on Australia to tell us what it is or what it isn't. Those countries, like the United States, thanks to former President Trump, that recognize that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, are simply affording the sole Jewish nation the same dignity and the same right to determine its capital, which is afforded to every other nation on the planet.
Oh, Rabbi Menken, I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, that's all we have for right now. But thank you so much for coming on. As always, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Up next. Learn more about a mass tomorrow in Washington, D.C. to honor the Lily of the Mohawks. She is the first Native American to be recognized as a saint by the Catholic Church, and tomorrow marks the 10th anniversary of the canonization of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. Known as the Lily of the Mohawks, she was canonized by Pope Benedict XVI and was beatified by St. John Paul II. Tomorrow, in honor of the 10th anniversary, a special mass will be held at the St. John Paul II National Shrine in Washington, D.C. And we go now to Father Maurice Henry Sands, Executive Director of the Black and Indian Mission Office, who will give the homily at Mass tomorrow. Father Sands, great to be with you. Thank you for your time. St. Kateri only spent about 24 hours on this earth, but what a life she lived. What can you tell us about her?
So she lived in the 1600s. She was born in a Mohawk community a little bit west of Albany. She lost her parents at a very young age because they died during a smallpox epidemic, and it left her very weakened and disfigured. But her mother was Christian. She passed along to her, in the very short time she was with the Catholic faith, the Christian faith, and then she met Jesuit missionaries at the age of 11 and had a great desire to become Catholic, and she ended up leaving her home in New York State to go to a Catholic community near Montreal in Canada so that she could live out her life as a disciple of Jesus Christ. She experienced a lot of suffering in her life, but she lived a life of heroic virtue, and there is much that she can teach us from the very short life that she lived.
Absolutely. Can you talk about Mass tomorrow? Also, we did mention that you'll be giving the homily. Can you give us a little preview of, what you're going to say?
Sure. So tomorrow, the main celebrant of the Mass will be Bishop Chad Zielinski. He was recently installed as the Bishop of New Ulm, Minnesota. He would have been serving in the Diocese of Fairbanks, and he's the chair of the USCCB Subcommittee on Native American Affairs, so he'll be the main celebrant. And I will be speaking about St. Kateri and how she inspires all of us to live holy lives. She had a great love for the Lord. She loved to pray. She had a great love for the Eucharist, a great love for our Blessed Mother, for praying the Rosary. She was a great champion of assisting her brothers and sisters in need. And like the other saint who we're celebrating this weekend, Saint Pope John Paul II, she experienced a lot of suffering early in her life, and I'm sure that suffering was very formative in helping her to develop a very profound relationship with our Lord and also with our Blessed Mother. And she was very determined in her efforts to look for the place where she could live as a very devoted disciple of our Lord Jesus Christ. She also wanted to become a consecrated virgin, which she was able to fulfill. So she overcame many difficulties and obstacles to pursue her objective of living a radical life for our Lord Jesus Christ, living a radically holy life. And so that's why she has so much to teach all of us. And she's a great inspiration to everyone from the time that she lived to the present. She is a very popular saint among young people. There are many young ladies who choose her name as their confirmation name. And I think that for young people, they can see that someone just like them was, a very radical disciple of Jesus Christ, that she gave all for the Lord and for his people, and that there's much that they can learn from her.
Yeah, for sure. She's so inspiring indeed. We have about a minute or so left, but I know there's some events that are taking place at the St. John Paul II Shrine tomorrow. Can you quickly tell us about that?
Sure. The Knights of Columbus started an initiative in 2019 that they call the Native American Solidarity Initiative, because they recognize that in their efforts to go out to the peripheries to help brothers and sisters in need, that there were brothers and sisters on the periphery right in our own country. So my office, which is the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, has worked very closely with the Knights since the launch of the Solidarity Initiative, and we've undertaken various activities. So it just seemed like a very natural place for us to celebrate this special Mass in honor of St. Kateri, because, you know, they're very interested in helping Native American Catholics and other Native Americans to come to know our Lord Jesus Christ, to have faith in him, and to live their lives as member of his body. And so we have invited Native Americans from all over the country and other friends, you know, from nearby and from far away, who will be with us tomorrow for this wonderful celebration.
Oh, Father, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. God bless you.
You're welcome. And thank you for the invitation to address everyone. God bless everybody.
And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.